Kelly, middle school language arts teacher and author of Lucia Chronicles. Today's video is the fourth in my Elements of Literature series, and so far we have covered character, setting, plot, and today's video is about conflict. So basically I'm going to try and keep this as simple as possible. Conflict is the fancy way of saying that there's a problem in your story. So conflict can be internal or external, and that's exactly as it sounds. Internal meaning it's a conflict inside the character, and external means that it's a conflict or a problem outside of the character. Now it gets a little more complicated because there's also types of conflict like versus, like you have your protagonist versus your antagonist, which is essentially you know, man versus man. There can be man versus nature. Man versus man would be like Harry Potter. Man versus nature would be like Gary Paulson's Hatchet. There can be man versus society, which could be maybe like iRobot or something, which if you didn't know, iRobot was actually a book before it was a movie, as were most good movies. They were books first. There can be man versus himself, which would be an internal conflict, and I always explain that to my students as, you know, deciding whether or not to go along with the crowd or deciding whether or not to, you know, steal a pack of gum in the store would be your internal conflict, your man versus himself. So let's see, we have man versus man, man versus nature, man versus society, man versus himself. I'd say that those are probably your main four that you're going to work with. I'd say that most commonly throughout a story there's more than one conflict. So oftentimes we might have, you know, in the Lucia Chronicles there's a snowstorm that causes a certain chain of events to happen in the first book, The Prophecy. So that would be man versus nature. But overall, the overarching theme is man versus society, because Lucia is kind of going against the grain of the greater good and everyone doing their fair share that's been established in the nation. So there's also man versus himself, because Lucia has to grapple with whether or not she wants to accept herself as the light of the prophecy. And then there's man versus man, because there's Eve Malcor. So conflict, which I'm going to elaborate on in a second. So conflict is internal, external, and your four main ones would be man versus man, man versus society, man versus nature, and man versus himself. And you can have more than one conflict in your story. In fact, I encourage you to have like sub-conflicts almost. You should have one overarching conflict, kind of like how in one of the other videos I mentioned the overarching conflict in Harry Potter is man versus man, you know, Lord Voldemort versus Harry. But then each novel has multiple other conflicts that Hermione, Ron, and Harry need to overcome in order to get to that penultimate conflict that you have at the end of the series. So speaking of Eve Malcor, today is the official release date, June 30th, of The Girl Who Wasn't Loved, which is my novella that I wrote in February for my February is for Writers Challenge. It's about 146 pages, and if you're not familiar with what a novella is typically longer than a short story but shorter than a novel. Most of my novels, all three of my novels so far, are over 300 pages. So this is only about 146, and basically I went off the premise that every villain is the protagonist of their own story. They're their own hero. So not everyone who is evil started out that way. Everyone has a story, and this is hers. So this is a story from some of the events from Eve's perspective, and it starts when she was a little girl and ends with a meeting with Lucia that if you haven't read book 3, I recommend reading The Beacon. I recommend reading this after that, otherwise it's a tiny bit of a spoiler. And also earlier this week, or I guess it would be last week, I published my first children's book called The Moon People. I ended up illustrating it myself. I really wanted to look for an illustrator, but my budget just did not allow for the kind of quality illustrations that I wanted. So I've recently kind of gotten back into my coloring and my drawing, and I decided to draw my own pictures. So this is the story of Michael and he is found by Manfred of the Moon People. They're in search for a human child because a human child is the most brave, and they're afraid of the shadows on the moon. So he takes Michael to discover what lurks in the shadows and help his fellow moon people. So that is my first children's picture book. I don't know if it'll be my last children's book or not, but it's dedicated to someone very special. Well, it's dedicated to my friend's kids, but the protagonist is someone extra special. So that's what's going on in my world. This video is mainly about conflict, and the last video in the series will be about resolution. So that's all I have for you today. In the meanwhile, happy reading and happy writing.